The stagecoach rattled over the rough terrain, kicking up dust that swirled and settled in the late afternoon sun as it approached Rico, Colorado in the autumn of 1883. Inside, Penelope Harris clutched her small carpetbag with trembling hands, her head pounding with each jolt of the coach. She had traveled for weeks from Boston to meet her future husband, a man she knew only through 6 exchanged letters, and a small, faded photograph tucked inside her locket. "Miss, you ain't looking too well," the elderly woman sitting across from her observed, concern etching deep lines around her eyes. "I'm fine, thank you," Penelope whispered, though she knew it was a lie. For 3 days, she had fought the growing heat in her body, the aches that seemed to seep into her very bones. The further west they traveled, the worse she felt, but she couldn't turn back now. Everything she owned was packed in her trunk, and the life she'd left behind in Boston held nothing but painful memories of her parents' deaths and the subsequent poverty that had driven her to become a mail-order bride. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the Rico General Store, and Penelope gathered what little strength remained to step down. The world tilted precariously as her feet touched the dirt road. The mountains surrounding the mining town seemed to sway, their majestic peaks blurring in her fever-addled vision. "Miss Harris, Penelope Harris," a deep voice cut through the fog in her mind. She turned toward the sound, making out the tall figure of a man approaching from the direction of the livery stable. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he had a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. "Mr. Harrington." She managed, recalling the name of her intended. "No, madam, name's Russell Hayes. I work for Mr. Harrington's ranch. He sent me to fetch you." The man's expression shifted to concern as he drew closer. "Miss, are you unwell?" Penelope tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The buildings around her began to spin, the ground beneath her feet seeming to tilt. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of strong arms catching her as darkness claimed her consciousness. Russell Hayes hadn't expected to catch a fainting woman when he rode into town that afternoon. Daniel Harrington had sent him to collect his mail-order bride from Boston and bring her back to the Lazy H Ranch. It was supposed to be a simple task: meet the woman, load her trunk, and drive her the 10 miles to the ranch where his boss awaited. Instead, he now found himself with an armful of unconscious woman burning with fever. "Doc Miller," Russell shouted, lifting Penelope fully into his arms. Her body was alarmingly hot against his chest as he carried her across the street toward the doctor's office. "Doc, I need help here." The town's physician emerged from his office, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyes widened at the sight of Russell carrying the unconscious woman. "Bring her in," Doc Miller instructed, holding the door open. "What happened?" She just arrived on the stage. "Fainted dead away the moment she stepped down. She's burning up something fierce," Russell explained, laying Penelope gently on the examination table. Doc Miller pressed his palm to Penelope's forehead and frowned deeply. "This is a dangerous fever. How long has she been like this?" "I don't know. Just met her. She's Mr. Harrington's intended bride." The doctor shook his head gravely. "She can't be moved in this condition. The fever must be broken before she can travel anywhere." Russell ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Daniel's expecting her at the ranch tonight." "Well, he'll have to wait," Doc Miller said firmly, already mixing medicines at his work table. "This young lady is in no condition to go anywhere. She needs constant care for at least several days." Russell paced the small office, torn between his duty to his employer and the obvious needs of this sick woman. "I'll ride out and tell Daniel. He can come to town and see to her." Doc Miller shook his head. "That won't do. Daniel Harrington is nearly 70 years old. He can't provide the round-the-clock care she needs." The doctor paused, fixing Russell with a pointed look. "You're young and strong. You worked as a medic during the war, didn't you?" "Yes, but then you know what needs to be done. Someone needs to stay with her, cool her fever, make sure she drinks water when she's able. I have other patients to see to, and my wife is visiting her sister in Denver." Russell glanced at the woman on the table. Her face was flushed, her breathing shallow. Her bonnet had fallen away, revealing auburn hair that spilled across the examination table like copper waves. Even in her distress, there was something striking about her delicate features. "Daniel won't like this," Russell muttered. "Daniel will like it even less if his bride dies of fever before they even meet," the doctor countered. "I'll prepare a room at the boarding house. You'll need to stay with her." Russell sighed heavily, knowing he had no real choice. "I'll take care of her. But someone needs to tell Daniel what's happened." "I'll send Billy Jenkins out to the ranch with a message," Doc Miller said, already preparing a cold compress for Penelope's forehead. "Now help me get her to the boarding house. We have work to do if we're going to save this young lady's life." The boarding house room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair beside a window that overlooked Rico's Main Street. Russell settled into the chair after helping Doc Miller transfer Penelope to the bed. The doctor had administered medicines, left detailed instructions, and promised to return in the morning. Russell removed his hat and coat, rolling up his sleeves as he prepared for a long night. He soaked a cloth in the basin of cool water the boarding house keeper had provided and gently placed it on Penelope's forehead. "Miss Harris," he said softly, though he doubted she could hear him in her delirious state. "I don't know what brought you all this way to marry a man you've never met, but I aim to make sure you live long enough to at least lay eyes on him." Throughout that first night, Russell diligently changed the cool compresses on Penelope's forehead. Sometimes she would stir, mumbling incoherently about trains and letters and promises. Once she opened her eyes, but they were glazed with fever and showed no recognition of her surroundings. "Water," Russell urged during these brief moments of semi-consciousness, holding a cup to her parched lips. "Just a little, Miss Harris." The hours stretched endlessly. Dawn found Russell still at his post, exhausted but vigilant. Mrs. Blackburn, the boarding housekeeper, brought fresh water and breakfast, tutting sympathetically at the sight of the sick woman. "Poor dear," she said, placing a tray on the small table. "Traveled all this way only to fall ill. You're a good man, Mr. Hayes, caring for her like this." Russell shrugged uncomfortably. "Just doing what needs doing, madam. Still, it's more than most would do." She patted his shoulder before leaving. "I'll bring more cool water in an hour." Doc Miller arrived mid-morning, examining Penelope with a grave expression. "The fever hasn't broken yet. Keep doing what you're doing. I'll leave more medicine." "What if it doesn't work?" Russell asked, voicing the fear that had grown throughout the night as he watched Penelope struggle. "Then we pray," Doc Miller answered simply. The second day brought no improvement. Russell continued his vigil, speaking softly to Penelope when she grew restless, cooling her burning skin with gentle strokes of the damp cloth. His back ached from the uncomfortable chair, and fatigue clouded his mind, but he refused Mrs. Blackburn's offer to spell him for a few hours. "I gave my word I'd care for her," he insisted. Late that evening, a commotion downstairs announced the arrival of Daniel Harrington. The old rancher's voice carried up the stairwell, demanding to see his bride. Russell tensed, preparing himself for the confrontation. Daniel burst into the room, his weathered face lined with worry and impatience. "What's this about my bride being too sick to travel? I've been waiting 2 months for her arrival." "Lower your voice," Russell commanded quietly, nodding toward the feverish woman. "She's fighting for her life, Daniel." The older man's expression softened slightly as he approached the bed, seeing Penelope's condition for himself. "What's wrong with her?" "Doc thinks it's a severe influenza, possibly caught on the journey west. She needs constant care until the fever breaks." Daniel removed his hat, twisting it in his gnarled hands. "I need a wife, Russell. The ranch is too much for me alone. That's why I sent for her." "I understand," Russell said, though something in him bristled at the older man's concern for his own needs when Penelope was so ill. "But she can't be your wife if she doesn't survive." Daniel sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping with the weight of his 70 years. "You're right, of course. How long does the doc think before she recovers?" "He can't say for sure. Days, maybe a week." The older man nodded slowly. "I can't stay in town. Spring calving has started, and I'm shorthanded as it is with you here." He glanced at Russell. "You'll continue to care for her?" "Yes, good man." Daniel cast one more look at Penelope before turning to leave. Send word when she's well enough to travel to the ranch. After Daniel left, Russell returned to his task, refreshing the cloth on Penelope's forehead. Don't you worry, Miss Harris, he murmured. You take your time getting better. The ranch will still be there when you're ready. The third day brought a brief moment of clarity for Penelope. Her eyes opened as Russell was placing a fresh compress on her forehead, and this time recognition flickered in their depths. Who are you? She whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Russell startled at the sound, then leaned forward, relief washing over him. Russell Hayes, miss. I work for Mr. Harrington. You're in Rico at the boarding house. I remember the stagecoach, she said faintly. I wasn't well, you've been very sick, but you're going to be fine now. He offered her water, which she accepted gratefully. Mr. Harrington, she asked after drinking. He came to see you yesterday. He's back at the ranch waiting for you to recover. A small frown creased her brow. I don't remember seeing him. You were deep in fever dreams. Russell hesitated, then added, he's anxious to meet you properly when you're well. Penelope's eyes began to drift closed again. Thank you for caring for me, Mr. Hayes. Russell, he corrected gently, you should rest now. She managed a tiny nod before sleep claimed her once more. Russell found himself studying her face, noticing for the first time the sprinkling of freckles across the bridge of her nose and the gentle curve of her mouth. Something protective stirred in his chest, something that went beyond his duty to his employer. Rest easy, Penelope, he whispered, using her given name for the first time. The fourth day brought a setback. Penelope's fever, which had seemed to be easing, spiked again by midday. Her breathing grew labored, and she thrashed restlessly in the bed, caught in the grip of terrible dreams. No, please, she cried out, her hands clutching at the bedsheets. Don't leave me here. Russell, who had stepped out briefly to stretch his legs, rushed back to her side. Penelope, you're safe, he assured her, taking one of her hands in his. I'm right here. Doc Miller, summoned by a worried Mrs. Blackburn, arrived quickly. We need to bring that fever down now, he said grimly after examining her. Help me sit her up. Together, they propped Penelope against the pillows while the doctor prepared a stronger medication. She needs to drink all of this, he instructed, handing a small glass to Russell. And we need to cool her body more aggressively. Following the doctor's lead, Russell helped sponge Penelope's arms and legs with cool water, speaking reassuringly to her throughout the process. When they had done all they could, Doc Miller left additional medicine and instructions. The next few hours will be critical, he warned, if the fever doesn't break by morning. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Russell understood the gravity of the situation. I'll stay with her every minute, he promised. That night was the longest of Russell's life. He abandoned the chair entirely, kneeling beside the bed as he continuously bathed Penelope's heated skin with cool cloths. He talked to her through the darkness, telling her about the ranch, the mountains, the wildflowers that would soon carpet the meadows. You have to see them, Penelope, he urged as he wrung out another cloth. They're like nothing you've ever seen in Boston. And the stars out here, they're so bright and close you feel like you could reach up and pluck one right out of the sky. In the darkest hour of the night, when Penelope's breathing became so shallow Russell feared each breath might be her last, he found himself praying for the first time since the war. Please, he whispered, holding her limp hand between both of his. Please don't take her. She's come so far and she deserves her chance at happiness, whatever that might be. As dawn approached, Russell dozed briefly, his head resting on the edge of the bed, his hand still holding Penelope's. He woke with a start when he felt movement, her fingers twitching against his palm. He lifted his head to find Penelope's eyes open, clearer than he'd seen them since her arrival. Russell, she said weakly. He straightened immediately, reaching for her forehead. The burning heat was gone, replaced by the normal warmth of healthy skin. The fever had broken. You're back, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief. Was I gone? A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Far enough that I was worried you might not find your way back. He helped her take a sip of water. How do you feel? Weak as a newborn kitten, she admitted. But my head is clear now, I remember more. You've been caring for me all this time. Russell nodded, suddenly self-conscious under her steady gaze. Someone had to do it. "Thank you," she said simply, but the gratitude in her eyes spoke volumes more. Doc Miller's visit later that morning confirmed what Russell already knew: the crisis had passed. Penelope would recover, though she would need several more days of rest before she could travel to the ranch. "You've done a remarkable job, Russell," the doctor said as they stepped outside the room to let Penelope rest. Many would have given up, especially after the setback yesterday. Russell shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I wasn't about to let her die on my watch." Doc Miller studied him thoughtfully. "It's more than that, I think, but that's between you and your conscience." He patted Russell's shoulder. "Get some rest yourself. She's out of danger now, but she'll still need care for a few more days." The fifth day brought a more alert and talkative Penelope. She was able to sit up in bed, supported by pillows, and take some broth that Mrs. Blackburn prepared. Russell, who had finally allowed himself a few hours of proper sleep in a neighboring room, returned to find her looking almost like a different person. "Your color's much better," he observed, taking his now familiar seat beside the bed. "Mrs. Blackburn helped me wash my face and brush my hair," Penelope explained, self-consciously touching the loose braid that hung over one shoulder. "I must have looked frightful these past days." "You looked sick," Russell corrected. "Now you look like someone on the mend, thanks to you." She studied him with curious eyes. "Mrs. Blackburn tells me you've barely left this room since I arrived." Russell shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't proper to leave you alone." "No, I suppose not." She looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. "Though I imagine it wasn't what Mr. Harrington had in mind when he sent you to collect me. Daniel understands. He wants you well before you come to the ranch." Russell hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at him. "If you don't mind my asking, why did you agree to marry a man you've never met, especially one so much older than yourself?" Penelope didn't answer immediately, her gaze drifting to the window where sunlight streamed into the room. "My parents died last winter. Influenza ironic, isn't it? They left debts and I had to sell our home to settle them. I worked as a seamstress, but the pay was barely enough to keep a roof over my head." She met his eyes again. "Mr. Harrington's advertisement promised security and respectability. His letters were kind if brief. He didn't make grand romantic promises, just offered a decent life and honest partnership. And that was enough. When you have nothing, Mr. Hayes Russell's security becomes very appealing." A hint of defensiveness crept into her tone. "I'm 23 years old. In Boston, I was already considered firmly on the shelf. My prospects there were limited." Russell nodded slowly. "I meant no offense. Daniel is a good man, if gruff. He'll treat you fairly." "And what about you?" Penelope asked, changing the subject. "How did you come to work for Mr. Harrington?" "After the war, I drifted west. Couldn't settle anywhere for long. 3 years ago, I was passing through Rico when my horse came up lame. Daniel needed help with the spring roundup and offered me work. I've been there ever since." "You fought in the war. You must have been very young. 18 when I enlisted, 19 when I saw my first real battle." Russell's expression grew distant. "Served as a cavalry scout first, then as a field medic when they discovered I had a steady hand and a strong stomach." "Is that how you knew what to do for me?" Penelope asked softly. Russell nodded, pushing away the memories. "Some skills you don't forget, even when you'd like to." The sixth day marked Penelope's first tentative steps out of bed. Russell hovered nearby as she made her way to the chair by the window, ready to catch her if her strength failed. "I feel like a wobbling calf," she admitted with a self-conscious laugh as she sank gratefully into the chair. "You're doing remarkably well for someone who nearly died a few days ago," Russell pointed out, pulling another chair close to hers. The sunlight illuminated her features, bringing a golden glow to her skin that had been so pale just days before. Her hair, fully unbound today, caught the light in shades of copper and auburn. Russell found himself staring and quickly looked away when she caught his eye. "Mr. Harrington sent a message," he said, changing the subject. "He's asking when you might be well enough to travel to the ranch." "Oh." Penelope's fingers nervously smoothed the fabric of her borrowed dressing gown. "What did you tell him?" "That it would be at least another day or two, according to Doc Miller. He's not a patient man, Daniel, but he understands you can't rush recovery." Penelope nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. I should probably write to him. It seems strange that he's to be my husband in a matter of days, yet we haven't even properly spoken. Russell felt an unexpected twist in his gut at her words. Over the past 6 days, he had come to know this woman in ways that transcended ordinary acquaintance. He had bathed her fevered brow, held her hand through nightmares, listened to her delirious murmurings, and watched over her with a devotion that surprised even himself. And now he was expected to deliver her to his employer, to step back and watch her become Daniel's wife. The thought sat like a stone in his stomach. "I'll bring you paper and ink if you'd like to write to him," he offered, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you," she said, but made no move to rise from the chair. Instead, she asked, "Would you tell me about the ranch? What will my life be like there?" Russell described the Lazy H, the sprawling main house that Daniel had built 20 years earlier for his first wife, the barns and corrals, the bunkhouse where the handful of ranch hands lived, the kitchen garden that had gone to seed after the housekeeper left the previous autumn. "It's a good piece of land," he said. 3,000 acres of valley and foothills. The creek runs year-round and the meadows are rich for grazing. Daniel runs about 500 head of cattle and a small remuda of horses. "And where do you live?" Penelope asked. "I have a small cabin near the south pasture. Daniel gave me permission to build it last year. I prefer my own space." Penelope was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "It sounds beautiful," she finally said. "Different from anything I've known, but beautiful." "It is," Russell agreed. "You'll grow to love it." She looked at him then, a question in her eyes that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. "I hope so," was all she said. That evening, after helping Penelope back to bed and ensuring she took her medicine, Russell stepped outside for the first time in days. The cool night air filled his lungs as he walked slowly down Rico's main street, his thoughts tumultuous. He was developing feelings for Penelope Harris. Dangerous, impossible feelings. She was Daniel's bride, brought west specifically to marry his employer. A man who had given Russell steady work, fair pay, and more trust than anyone had shown him since before the war. His loyalty should be unquestionable. And yet, with each hour spent at Penelope's side, with each glimpse of her courage, her dignity, her quiet humor in the face of adversity, Russell found himself drawn to her in ways he had no right to be. "Evening, Russell," Sheriff Cooper called from the doorway of his office. "Doc says your patient's on the mend." Russell nodded, pausing to speak with the lawman. "She's improving, should be well enough to travel to the ranch in another day or two. Good news for old Daniel, been waiting on a wife for a mighty long time." The sheriff studied Russell's troubled expression. "Though you're looking like a man with something weighing on his mind." "Just tired," Russell evaded. "Been a long week." "I'd imagine so. Not many men would have done what you did, sitting with a sick stranger day and night like that." "She wasn't a stranger by the second day," Russell said before he could stop himself. The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment. "Well, get some rest. You look like you need it." Russell continued his walk, the sheriff's perceptive gaze lingering in his memory. Was his inner conflict so obvious? Or was he imagining meanings in innocent remarks because of his own guilty conscience? When he returned to the boarding house, he found Mrs. Blackburn waiting for him with a folded piece of paper. "Miss Harris asked me to give you this," she said, handing him the note. "She's sleeping now. Poor dear was exhausted after her little adventure out of bed today." Russell thanked her and waited until he was alone in the hallway to unfold the paper. Penelope's handwriting was delicate but clear. "Russell, I realized I have never properly thanked you for saving my life. Words seem inadequate for such a debt, but they are all I have to offer. When I closed my eyes on that stagecoach, I was certain I would never open them again. That I am alive to write this note is entirely due to your care and dedication. Whatever life awaits me at the ranch, I will never forget what you have done for me these past days. With deepest gratitude, Penelope Harris." Russell read the note twice before carefully folding it and placing it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Her words were proper, appropriate, exactly what a grateful patient might say to her caretaker. Yet between the lines, he sensed something more, or perhaps it was merely his own wishful thinking. Either way, he knew what honor demanded. In another day or two, Penelope would become Mrs. Daniel Harrington, and Russell would return to being just another ranch hand. That was the way things had to be. The seventh morning dawned bright and clear. Russell, who had spent the night in the neighboring room at Mrs. Blackburn's insistence, knocked softly on Penelope's door after breakfast. "Come in," she called. He entered to find her fully dressed for the first time since her arrival, wearing a simple blue calico dress borrowed from Mrs. Blackburn's daughter. Her hair was neatly arranged in a loose knot at the nape of her neck, and though she was still pale, there was a new steadiness in her movements as she stood by the window. "You look well," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I feel almost myself again," she replied with a smile that transformed her face, bringing a sparkle to her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "Doc Miller says I can travel tomorrow if I continue to improve. That's good news." Russell forced enthusiasm into his tone. "Daniel will be pleased." "Yes," Penelope's smile faltered slightly. "I've written to him. Mrs. Blackburn promised to have the letter delivered today." An awkward silence fell between them. For the past week, their interactions had been defined by the medical necessity of her condition. Now, with Penelope recovered, they found themselves in an uncertain territory, no longer patient and caretaker, but not quite friends either. "Would you like to take some air?" Russell suggested, breaking the tension. "Doc Miller said short walks would be good for building your strength back." Penelope nodded gratefully. "I would like that very much. I've seen nothing of Rico except through that window." Russell offered his arm, which she took with only slight hesitation. They descended the stairs slowly, her steps still somewhat unsteady after days of bed rest. Mrs. Blackburn watched their progress with an approving nod. "Just a short walk, mind," she cautioned. "Don't want to overtire yourself before your big day tomorrow." Outside, the spring sunshine bathed the small mining town in golden light. Rico had been founded just a few years earlier when silver was discovered in the surrounding mountains. Though not as rowdy as some mining towns Russell had seen, it still had its share of saloons and rough characters. Today, however, the main street was relatively quiet, with just the usual traffic of miners, shopkeepers, and townspeople going about their business. "It's so different from Boston," Penelope observed as they walked slowly past the general store. "Everything there is so established, so permanent. Here it feels like the whole town might just pick up and move if the silver runs out." "That's happened to more than one town out here," Russell confirmed, "but Rico's doing well. The mines are producing and there's good grazing land for livestock. It'll likely stick." They continued their careful progress down the street, Penelope's arm warm against Russell's as she leaned on him for support. He was acutely aware of every point of contact between them, of the clean scent of soap in her hair, of the way she unconsciously tightened her grip on his arm when they navigated an uneven section of the boardwalk. "Russell, Miss Harris," the call came from behind them. They turned to see Doc Miller approaching, medical bag in hand. "I was just coming to check on you," he said, smiling at the sight of Penelope up and about, "but I can see you're making excellent progress." "Thanks to your medicine and Mr. Hayes's care," Penelope replied politely. "Indeed." The doctor's eyes moved thoughtfully between them. "A remarkable recovery. I've sent word to Daniel that you should be well enough to travel to the ranch tomorrow." "Yes, Mrs. Blackburn mentioned that," Penelope said, her voice carefully neutral. The doctor nodded, then addressed Russell. "Daniel sent a message asking if you could ride out to the ranch today. Something about preparations for Miss Harris's arrival. He said to tell you Jenkins can stay with Miss Harris for the remainder of today." Russell frowned. "Is Jenkins in town?" "Arrived about an hour ago." "He's at the livery getting his horse seen to." Russell felt Penelope's arm stiffen slightly against his. He looked down at her, but her expression revealed nothing. "If you need to go, please don't feel obligated to stay on my account," she said softly. "I'm much better now." Russell hesitated, torn between his duty to Daniel and his reluctance to leave Penelope's side. "Are you certain? I promised to see you safely to the ranch." "And you shall tomorrow." Penelope managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But if Mr. Harrington needs you today, you should go." Doc Miller, observing this exchange, cleared his throat. I'll be checking on Miss Harris this afternoon and again in the morning before she travels, and Mrs. Blackburn will be looking in on her regularly." Still Russell hesitated, but he knew his duty. "Very well," he finally agreed. "I'll find Jenkins and then ride out to the ranch, but I'll return first thing in the morning to escort you to your new home." They walked back to the boarding house in silence, the easy camaraderie of earlier replaced by a subtle tension. At the door, Penelope released his arm and took a small step away from him. "Thank you for the walk, Mr. Hayes," she said formally, "and for everything else." The return to his surname didn't escape Russell's notice. "It was my honor, Miss Harris," he responded in kind, tipping his hat before turning to leave. He found Billy Jenkins at the livery stable, a gangling young cowhand with more enthusiasm than experience. After instructing him to stay close to the boarding house in case Penelope needed anything, Russell saddled his horse for the ride to the Lazy H. The 10-mile journey gave him too much time to think. Tomorrow, Penelope would marry Daniel in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Judge Wilson officiating. It was arranged, agreed upon, expected. The fact that Russell had developed feelings for her during her illness was irrelevant, a complication that honor demanded he ignore. Daniel Harrington was waiting on the front porch of the ranch house when Russell rode in. The older man looked more spruced up than usual, his white hair trimmed and his normally wild beard neatly combed. "About time you got here," he called gruffly as Russell dismounted. "Got a list of things need doing before my bride arrives tomorrow. She's much improved," Russell reported, tethering his horse to the hitching post. "Doc thinks she'll be strong enough for the trip." "Good, good," Daniel rubbed his hands together. "Come inside." Martha's been helping get the house ready. Russell followed his employer into the ranch house. Martha Turner, the widow from the neighboring ranch who sometimes helped with cooking for the hands, had indeed been busy. The main rooms had been thoroughly cleaned, with fresh curtains at the windows and new cushions on the worn furniture. "Looks nice," Russell commented, noting the vase of early spring wildflowers on the dining table. "Woman's touch makes all the difference," Daniel said with satisfaction. Been too long since this house had a proper mistress. Daniel's first wife had died 15 years earlier. Since then, the rancher had employed a succession of housekeepers, but none had stayed long. The isolation of the ranch and Daniel's increasingly gruff manner had driven most away within months. "Now, about tomorrow," Daniel continued, unrolling a piece of paper on the table. "Judge Wilson will be here at noon for the ceremony. Martha's preparing a special dinner. I need you to make sure everything's ready for Miss Harris's arrival." As Daniel outlined his plans, Russell found it increasingly difficult to focus on the older man's words. All he could think of was Penelope in her blue calico dress, her arm linked with his as they walked down Rico's main street. How would she fare here, miles from town, married to a man 50 years her senior, Russell? "Are you listening to me, boy?" Daniel's sharp question snapped him back to the present. "Yes, sir, sorry, just thinking about what else needs to be done." Daniel eyed him suspiciously. "You look all in." "Taking care of a sick woman for a week would wear on any man. Go get some rest in your cabin. I need you sharp tomorrow." Russell nodded and took his leave, walking the quarter-mile to his small cabin near the south pasture. The structure was simple but solid, a single room with a stone fireplace, a bed, a table and chair, and shelves for his few possessions. It had always been enough, a place of his own after years of wandering. Today, however, it felt emptier than usual. He built a small fire to ward off the spring chill and sat in the single chair, staring into the flames. The folded note from Penelope was still in his shirt pocket. He took it out, reading her graceful handwriting once more before carefully replacing it. What kind of a man coveted another man's bride? What kind of a man, especially one who owed his livelihood to his employer, would even consider acting on such feelings? Not an honorable one, Russell decided grimly. And whatever else he had lost in life, he had always tried to maintain his honor. Tomorrow he would escort Penelope to the ranch. He would stand witness as she married Daniel Harrington. And then he would do what he should have done years ago: move on, find work elsewhere, leave Rico and its memories behind. It was the only honorable choice. The dawn broke cloudy and cool with the promise of rain later in the day. Russell rose early, packed his few belongings into his saddlebags, and rode to the ranch house to speak with Daniel. The older man was already up, pacing the porch with nervous energy. "There you are," he called when Russell approached. "Everything set for the big day?" "Yes, sir, everything's ready." Russell dismounted and climbed the steps to the porch. "Daniel, there's something I need to tell you." The rancher paused, noting Russell's serious tone. "What is it, boy?" "Nothing wrong with Miss Harris, I hope?" "No, she's well enough to travel. It's about me." Russell took a deep breath. "After the wedding today, I'll be moving on." Daniel's bushy eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Moving on? What in tarnation for? Thought you were settled here." "I've been restless lately," Russell lied, "thinking it might be time to try something new." Daniel studied him skeptically. "This is mighty sudden. Does it have anything to do with Miss Harris?" Russell stiffened. "What do you mean? I'm old, not blind," Daniel said bluntly. "You spent a week nursing that woman back to health. Something changed between you two." "Nothing improper happened," Russell said firmly. "Miss Harris has been nothing but proper and grateful for the care she received." "Didn't say improper," said Change. Daniel sighed, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "Look, I know you, Russell. You're an honorable man. If you say nothing happened, then nothing happened, but that doesn't mean nothing changed." Russell remained silent, unwilling to either confirm or deny the perceptive observation. Daniel continued, his voice softer now. "I married my Catherine when I was 23 years old. We had 30 good years together before the fever took her. Never found anyone who measured up after that." He paused, his gaze distant with memory. "When I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I wasn't looking for grand passion, just companionship, someone to make this house a home again." "Penelope, Miss Harris will make you a fine wife," Russell said stiffly. "Maybe so." Daniel fixed him with a penetrating look. "Or maybe she won't get the chance." "What do you mean?" Daniel sighed heavily. "Go fetch her from town, Russell. Bring her here as planned, then we'll talk more about your future." Confused by the cryptic response but unable to press further, Russell nodded and mounted his horse for the ride to Rico. The town was just coming to life when he arrived, shopkeepers opening their doors, miners heading to the early shift. Russell tied his horse in front of the boarding house and went inside, where Mrs. Blackburn was setting the breakfast table. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," she greeted him. "Miss Harris is upstairs getting ready. Doc Miller's with her now, doing a final check before she travels." Russell nodded his thanks and waited in the small parlor, hat in hand, trying to calm his racing thoughts. When he heard footsteps on the stairs, he rose, steeling himself for what was to come. Penelope appeared, descending slowly with Doc Miller's support. She was wearing a new dress, a simple but elegant navy blue traveling outfit that must have come from her trunk. Her hair was arranged more formally than the day before, with a matching hat perched at an angle that framed her face perfectly. She looked beautiful and terrified. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she greeted him, her voice steady despite the apprehension in her eyes. "Miss Harris." He inclined his head respectfully. "Are you ready to travel?" "Doc Miller has given his approval," she confirmed. "My trunk has been brought down already." "I've examined Miss Harris thoroughly," the doctor added. "While she's not at full strength yet, she's well enough for the journey to the ranch. I've given her medicine to take with her, just in case." Russell nodded, noting the shadows under Penelope's eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well. "I've brought the buggy. It'll be more comfortable than horseback." After a light breakfast, during which Penelope merely picked at her food, they said their goodbyes to Mrs. Blackburn and Doc Miller. Russell loaded Penelope's trunk into the back of the buggy, then helped her up to the seat. Her hand trembled slightly in his as he assisted her, but her expression remained composed. The journey to the Lazy H passed mostly in silence. Russell pointed out landmarks, occasionally the creek that ran through the property, the southern pasture where the new calves were grazing with their mothers, the distant mountains that formed the backdrop to the ranch. Penelope responded politely, but volunteered little conversation of her own. As they approached the ranch house, Russell felt her tense beside him. "It's larger than I expected," she commented, gazing at the two-story structure ahead. "Daniel built it for his first wife," Russell explained. "It's a good, solid house." They pulled up to the hitching post in front of the porch. Daniel emerged immediately, dressed in his Sunday best, his white hair slicked back with pomade. "Miss Harris," he called, approaching the buggy with surprising agility for his age. "Welcome to the Lazy H." Russell jumped down and moved to help Penelope descend. As he took her hand, their eyes met briefly, and he saw in hers the same conflict he felt in his own heart. "Mr. Harrington," she acknowledged, turning to face her intended husband once her feet were on solid ground. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Daniel took her offered hand, bowing over it with old-fashioned courtesy. "The pleasure is all mine, Miss Harris. I'm mighty glad to see you recovered from your illness." He glanced at Russell. "Thanks to the dedicated care of my foreman here." "Yes," Penelope agreed softly. "Mr. Hayes was most attentive." "Come inside," Daniel invited. "Martha's prepared refreshments, and you should rest before the judge arrives at noon." Penelope allowed herself to be led toward the house, though she glanced back once at Russell, who remained by the buggy. "Aren't you coming, Mr. Hayes?" she asked. "I'll bring your trunk in, then see to the horses," he responded. Not meeting her eyes, Daniel nodded approvingly. "Join us inside when you're done, Russell. Need to talk to you about those matters we discussed earlier." As they disappeared into the house, Russell unloaded Penelope's trunk and carried it to the porch, then took the buggy and his horse to the stable. He worked methodically, taking longer than necessary with the unharnessing and grooming, delaying the moment when he would have to return to the house and witness the preparations for the wedding. Finally, with no more tasks to occupy him, he washed up at the pump and walked slowly back to the ranch house. Inside, he found Daniel alone in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour. "There you are," the older man said, gesturing to the chair opposite his. "Sit down. We need to finish our conversation." Russell obeyed, declining the offered drink with a shake of his head. "Where's Miss Harris?" "Resting in the guest room. Martha's with her." Daniel took a sip of his whiskey, studying Russell over the rim of the glass. "I had a long talk with Miss Harris just now." Russell tensed. "Oh, interesting young woman, very direct once you get her talking." Daniel set his glass down with deliberate care. "She told me about her time in Rico, about how you never left her side during the worst of her fever. About how you talked to her even when she was too delirious to respond, keeping her tethered to this world." Russell shifted uncomfortably. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Daniel contradicted firmly. "You did what few men would do. And in doing so, you formed a bond with that young lady that goes beyond ordinary acquaintance." Daniel, the older man, held up a hand, silencing him. "Let me finish. When I sent for a bride from back east, I was looking for companionship in my final years. Someone to cook my meals, keep my house, maybe share my bed now and then." He paused, a rueful smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "I wasn't expecting a young woman with fire in her eyes and opinions of her own. And I certainly wasn't expecting her to arrive half dead with fever and fall in love with my foreman while he nursed her back to health." Russell's head snapped up. "She said that?" "Not in so many words," Daniel admitted. "She's too proper for that. But I've lived long enough to recognize the signs, and I see them in you too, boy, plain as day." Russell opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again, unable to deny the truth. Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "I've lived my life, Russell, had my great love with Catherine. What I want now is peace and comfort in my remaining years. But Miss Harris, Penelope, she's young. She deserves more than to be an old man's nurse and companion." "What are you saying, Daniel?" Russell asked, hardly daring to hope. "I'm saying the judge will be here at noon," Daniel replied, rising from his chair, "and there will be a wedding as planned, but I won't be the groom." Russell stood as well, stunned. "Daniel, I can't." "You can and you will," Daniel interrupted firmly. "Unless I've completely misread the situation and you don't care for the girl." "Of course I care for her," Russell admitted, "more than I should, but then it's settled." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "I've already spoken to Judge Wilson. The papers will be changed." "What about Penelope? Has anyone consulted her about this?" Daniel's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Why don't you ask her yourself? She's in the garden out back." Russell stared at his employer in disbelief, then turned and strode through the house to the back door. He found Penelope seated on a bench beneath the apple tree, her face tilted up to catch the weak spring sunshine breaking through the clouds. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes widening slightly. "Russell." He stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure what to say or how to begin. "Daniel tells me there's been a change of plans." "Yes." A blush colored her cheeks. "He's a remarkable man, your employer." "Former employer, apparently," Russell said, taking a tentative step closer. "He says he's spoken to the judge about changing the marriage papers." Penelope nodded, her gaze steady on his face. "He has, but only if that's what you want as well." Russell closed the remaining distance between them, kneeling on the ground in front of her bench so their eyes were level. "Penelope, when you stepped off that stagecoach a week ago, delirious with fever, I had no idea my life was about to change forever. I thought I was simply doing my duty first to Daniel, then to you as a fellow human being in distress. And now," she prompted softly when he paused. "Now I know that what began as duty quickly became something else entirely." He took her hands in his, drawing strength from their warmth. "Those 7 days and nights by your bedside showed me that life can change in an instant, that connections can form in the most unexpected circumstances." Penelope's fingers tightened around his. "When I was lost in fever dreams, your voice was my anchor. You talked of mountains and wildflowers and stars so bright they seemed touchable. You promised me a life I had never imagined." "I meant every word," Russell assured her. "But I never thought I never dared hope that I might feel the same," Penelope finished for him. "How could I not? You saved my life, Russell, but more than that, you truly saw me when I was at my most vulnerable. No one has ever cared for me the way you did during those 7 days." Russell raised one hand to gently touch her cheek. "I love you, Penelope Harris. It happened so gradually and yet so completely that I didn't even recognize it until it was too late to deny. If you'll have me, I would be honored to be your husband." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes. "Are you certain? I came west to marry another man. I have no dowry, no family connections, nothing to offer but myself." "You are everything I never knew I wanted," Russell said simply. "And more than I ever dreamed I deserved," Penelope smiled through her tears. "Then yes, Russell Hayes, I will marry you today." When Judge Wilson arrived at noon, he found not one but 2 weddings to perform. First, Russell and Penelope exchanged their vows beneath the apple tree in the garden, their hands clasped tightly as they promised to love and honor each other for all their days. Then, to everyone's surprise, Daniel Harrington and Martha Turner stood before the judge to be joined in matrimony as well. "Figured it was high time I stopped pretending I hired her just for her cooking," Daniel explained with a grin when Russell expressed his astonishment. "We've been dancing around each other for 3 years now. Your whirlwind romance inspired us old folks to stop wasting time." The double wedding celebration lasted well into the evening, with ranch hands and neighbors joining in the festivities. As dusk fell, Russell found a moment alone with his new wife on the porch of his small cabin, now their home, until they could build something larger. "Happy, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, drawing her close as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Penelope replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "When I left Boston, I was seeking security and respectability. I never expected to find love. Funny how life works out," Russell mused. "If you hadn't fallen ill, if you hadn't cooled my brow for 7 days straight," she countered with a smile. "If Daniel hadn't been wise enough to see what was happening between us," Penelope turned in his arms to face him. "Then perhaps we should stop questioning our good fortune and simply be grateful for it." Russell smiled down at her, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You're right, as usual, though I have to admit I'm particularly grateful for that fever of yours." "Russell Hayes." Penelope exclaimed in mock outrage. "That's a terrible thing to say." "But true," he insisted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Without it, you would have married Daniel as planned, and I would have left Rico with a broken heart." "Then I suppose I should be grateful as well," Penelope conceded, rising on tiptoe to press a soft kiss to his lips. "Though I don't recommend influenza as a pathway to true love," Russell laughed, pulling her closer. "No, but it certainly worked for us." And I promise you, Penelope Hayes, I will continue to care for you with the same devotion for all the days of our life together. I'm counting on it, she whispered against his lips as the stars continued to emerge above them, bright and close enough to touch, just as he had promised during those long nights by her bedside. 5 years later, Russell stood on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands, watching as Penelope showed their 3-year-old son Robert how to feed the chickens that scratched in the yard. Their 1-year-old daughter Rebecca napped inside, while evidence of another child on the way showed in the gentle swell of Penelope's abdomen. The Lazy H Ranch had prospered under the joint management of Russell and Daniel, with both men's wives bringing their own strengths to the operation. Daniel and Martha lived contentedly in the main ranch house, while Russell and Penelope had built their home a quarter-mile away on a rise overlooking the creek. "Papa, look," Robert called excitedly as a hen pecked grain from his small palm. "She likes me." "That she does, son," Russell agreed, smiling at his boy's delight. Penelope looked up, meeting her husband's gaze with the same love that had grown stronger with each passing year. She excused herself from their son and walked to join Russell on the porch, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about, looking so thoughtful?" she asked. "Just remembering," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. "The day you arrived in Rico, more dead than alive, how scared I was that you wouldn't make it through that first night." Penelope leaned against him, a position that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "My night in Dusty Chaps," she teased. "Who would have thought that 7 days of fever would lead to all this?" Russell wrapped his arm around her waist, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child. "Best 7 days of my life, though I didn't know it at the time." "And now?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Now every day is better than the last," he told her, bending to kiss her forehead in the same spot where he had once placed cool cloths to drive away a deadly fever. "And I wouldn't change a single moment of our journey." As the sun began to set over the mountains that had become their home, they stood together in the glow of the life they had built, a life born from duty and fever, nurtured by devotion, and sustained by a love that had begun in the most unexpected circumstances but would endure for all their days.